Some nurses should spend less time playing hero and more time following orders. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before everything changed. Katie Morrison didn't flinch when she heard it. Didn't blink. Didn't pause mid-stride as she moved through the ICU corridors of Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah, her steady hands checking monitors, adjusting for drips, charting vitals with the meticulous precision of someone who had learned long ago that precision kept people alive. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant machinery, and the air tasted of antiseptic and the metallic bite of stainless steel. Her left leg dragged slightly on the turn to wardroom 407, a whisper of scarring that ran from hip to ankle, 20 years old and still pulling when she'd been on her feet for 9 hours straight. Nobody noticed anymore. Or if they did, they didn't ask. The ICU was her world now, this narrow kingdom of beeping monitors and ventilator hisses, where she'd spent the last 18 years nursing broken bodies back from the edge. Before that, different bodies. Different country. Different kind of broken. Helmand Province, 2004 to 2012. 3 tours. 16 confirmed field saves during operations in the Jolin district. 1 roadside bomb that changed everything. Her hands moved on their own through the evening rounds, checking the 73-year-old in 407 whose heart was skipping beats again, adjusting the bear hugger warming blanket on the trauma patient in 413 who was still fighting his way back from a construction accident, stopping briefly at 421 where an elderly woman lay quietly, machines breathing for her. Katie knew all their names. Knew their families. Knew the particular angle of each one's surrender or fight. The attending physicians didn't know her name. Just the nurse who asks too many questions about why we're running all these tests. She moved through the shift like water finding the lowest point, present but unnoticed. That was the skill nobody taught you in 20 years of military medicine, how to be invisible while carrying the weight of every life in the room. How to stay silent when you saw something wrong. How to keep your jaw tight and your voice level and your hands from shaking when someone said something that landed like shrapnel. She'd learned that part in Helmand. In the field surgical tents where the only way to survive the sight of what you were holding together was to stop feeling it. To let the work become the prayer. To touch the flag in her locker each shift and remember that feeling was a luxury she'd surrendered at 22 years old and never asked to have back. Dr. Caldwell arrived during the 6 p.m. rounds like a storm front moving through the corridors. His Italian shoes, Salvatore Ferragamo, Katie noticed because she noticed everything now, clicked against the tile in a rhythm that said confidence, authority, the particular gait of a man who had never once been questioned. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that photographed well and the kind of smile that made you forget you were supposed to be watching what he actually did. His white coat was pristine, untouched by the real work of the hospital, and his eyes moved across patient charts with the focus of someone cataloging inventory rather than lives. Katie was in room 411 when he approached, adjusting the 4 rate on a sepsis patient whose white blood count was climbing despite 3 antibiotics, and she felt the shift in air pressure before she saw him. His presence made the room smaller. Ms. Morrison. He didn't use her first name. Nobody did anymore, except the patients. Your documentation on this patient is excessive. 18 entries in 4 hours. We're not running a research lab here. Katie continued adjusting the line without turning. Temperature spiked again at 542. Lactate elevated. I flagged it for the attending. Flagging is documentation. The clinical care speaks for itself. He moved closer, his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than her weekly salary, preceding him like a warning. This hospital runs on efficiency, Ms. Morrison. Not, he paused, letting the silence do the work, heroics. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Katie's breath stayed level. Her hand stayed steady. Invisibility was armor. She'd learned that too. By 6:55 p.m., as Katie was restocking the crash cart on the 2nd floor, she heard him again. Dr. Caldwell stood by the vending machine in the break room, his voice carrying that particular quality of casual cruelty, the kind that only works if you deliver it like you're not trying. He was with 2 of the junior residents, both of them laughing on cue, the way people do when the power dynamic has already been established. Katie stood very still, her hand on the epinephrine vials, and listened. Some nurses should spend less time playing hero and more time following orders, he said, and she heard him tap the vending machine, heard the mechanical whir of something dropping into the slot. The residents laughed again. One of them said something she didn't catch. Caldwell responded, "Exactly. The ego on some of these people. Act like they're saving lives when really they're just slowing down the actual doctors." 48 minutes until the code came through. 48 minutes until Katie Morrison would need to use every single thing she'd learned in Helmand Province. 48 minutes until the person who called her a hero-complex nurse would either hate her or owe her everything, and she still didn't know which one he would choose. She finished stocking in silence and moved toward the locker room, her leg dragging slightly on the linoleum, the pain a small red thing she carried with her like a talisman. The lockers were in the basement, down a narrow corridor that nobody used during the day shifts. She stopped at hers, third row, left side, lock combination 14-32-8, and opened it slowly. Her shift bag was there. Her spare shoes. Her phone, turned off like it always was during work. And beneath everything, in the back corner, the folded flag. She reached for it without looking around, her fingers finding it in the darkness like muscle memory. Cotton, precisely creased, the weight of it no more than a few ounces but carrying the mass of something infinitely heavier. The flag that had been pressed into her hands 14 years ago by a chaplain whose name she'd never learned, the only piece of her former teammate that hadn't burned in the Chinook on the hillside outside Cost. She held it for exactly 4 seconds, her ritual, the only one she allowed herself, and her hands did something they never did in public. They trembled. Just barely. Just enough to remind her that she was still human, still carrying something that would never be put down, still the person who had learned that heroism was just another word for people who didn't have anywhere else to go. Then she folded it smaller, tucked it back into the corner of her locker, and closed the door. The phone in the ICU buzzed at 2:47 a.m. Katie heard it from the nurse's station, the way the emergency dispatch tone cut through the standard beeping of monitors. She was already moving before the announcement came through. Motor vehicle accident on Ion 95, exit 142. Massive trauma. Helicopter ETA for minutes. The attending surgeon was still in the hospital, Dr. Caldwell, of course, always working, always visible, always making sure everyone knew he was the only one who could save the ones nobody else could. Katie began pulling supplies without being asked. Crash cart check. Blood warmers. 2 units of O-negative from the cooler. Airway equipment on the counter. The ICU transformed in seconds from a place of quiet maintenance into a place of controlled chaos, the kind of choreography that only worked if everyone knew their part. She didn't think about what was coming. Didn't think about anything except the next task, the next thing her hands needed to do. The rotor wash shook the windows as the helicopter descended toward the landing pad on the north side of the hospital. Katie could feel it even from the trauma bay, the percussion of it, the way the building seemed to hold its breath. The ETA ticked down. 3 minutes. 2. 1. And then the trauma team was rolling through the doors with a stretcher that looked too small for the amount of damage on it, and Katie's eyes locked onto the patient's face for just long enough to freeze her entirely. Beneath the road rash and the trauma and the swelling, beneath the oxygen mask and the 4 lines that were already running, was a face she had last seen 20 years ago. Younger then. Terrified then. She had pulled him from a collapsed building in Helmand Province when he was 8 years old and small enough to carry in one hand. She had taken shrapnel meant for him. She had given him to the combat medics and never expected to see him again. He was supposed to be safe in whatever life he'd made after Kandahar. He was not supposed to be on a stretcher in Savannah, Georgia, with his ribs shattered and his breathing shallow and something inside him bleeding badly enough that the paramedics had called for 2 units of blood on arrival. Katie's hands found the 4 line. Her voice stayed level as she called out vitals. Her face showed nothing. This was the skill that mattered now. Not the remembering. Not the trembling in the locker room. Not the flag she'd held for seconds ago. This was Gunnery Sergeant Katie Morrison in her actual form, present, focused, and already calculating exactly what would need to happen if the surgeon was too slow. Thursday morning grand rounds. Cedar Creek Medical's main conference room, 18 staff members arranged around a polished oak table that gleamed like a weapon. Dr. Caldwell stood at the head, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light as he held Katie's patient chart aloft, his voice carrying the precise cruelty of someone accustomed to being unopposed. "Here we have Nurse Morrison's documentation," he announced, letting the papers flutter slightly for effect. 47 lines. For a simple catheter change. He turned to the resident seated along the wall, eyebrows elevated. This is what happens when nurses confuse themselves with physicians. This excessive documentation wastes hospital resources. It clutters our billing cycle. It suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of scope of practice. Katie sat 3 chairs down from him, her hands folded on the table. Her jaw tightened, a micro-expression, barely visible, but her breathing remained unchanged. She did not look away from the projection screen. Around her, younger residents exchanged glances. Someone smiled. Caldwell continued, building momentum like a conductor who'd found his rhythm. "We're not running a classroom here, people. We're running a hospital. Efficiency matters. Documentation matters when it's relevant. Excessive notation matters only to someone who doesn't trust the attending physician to know his own patients." He dropped the chart onto the table with deliberate casualness. "Nurse Morrison, your attention to detail is admirable. Your inability to trust your superiors is not." Katie's eyes remained fixed on the screen. Not a blink. Not a flush. Her colleague Sarah, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably. The moment stretched, 3 seconds, 4, 5, before Caldwell moved on to the next case, his point made, his audience suitably impressed by his authority. The impact of his words was precise. Designed. He'd chosen the time, the audience, the language specifically to humiliate without crossing the line into something formally actionable. She couldn't report him for stating facts about documentation. She couldn't file a complaint about a clinical observation. The cruelty was perfectly constructed, wrapped in the language of hospital management. Katie stood when grand rounds ended and walked to the third-floor supply station with the same measured pace she used for everything. She retrieved a fresh set of sterile gloves from the cabinet. She restocked the catheter trays. Her hands moved with precision, the muscle memory of 20 years of surgical support, the kind of competence that doesn't announce itself. 3 days later, shift change at 7 p.m. by the third-floor vending machine. Caldwell leaned against the wall with 4 other physicians, 2 surgeons, an anesthesiologist, a resident who looked like he was learning the art of laughter. Katie approached the machine, selecting her usual black coffee from the bottom row. She could hear Caldwell's voice before he raised it, building to its punchline like a rehearsed performance. "You know what they call Nurse Morrison in surgery?" His voice was loud enough for the entire nurses' station to hear. "The clipboard crusader. She thinks her job is to question every order instead of following it. Maybe she should spend less time playing hero and more time doing what she's told." The surgeons laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from power, from knowing the person being mocked can't respond without losing her job. Katie withdrew her coffee from the machine with the same deliberation she used for everything. She inserted 4 quarters for another cup. One for herself, she decided, was apparently not enough punishment. Sarah, her closest colleague, touched her arm as Katie walked past. Katie acknowledged it with a single nod, no words needed. The older nurse understood the calculus. Caldwell held institutional power like a man holding a knife. Any visible wound would be used against her. That night, alone in her apartment in Forsyth Park, Katie pressed her forehead against the cool tile of her bathroom wall and breathed. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The breathing technique they'd taught her after the IED had taken Marcus, after her leg had shattered like glass, after the medical discharge had turned her into a civilian with a soldier's nightmares. The breathing was how you survived things that weren't supposed to be survivable. The following Monday, outside the ICU entrance at 6:47 a.m. Katie was arriving for her shift when Caldwell stepped into her path, flanked by 2 security guards who looked genuinely uncomfortable about whatever was about to happen. His voice, when he spoke, had dropped to the register he used for serious threats, the tone of a man who knew he could destroy things without consequence. "One more incident, Morrison." He waited for her eyes to meet his. "One more questioning of my procedures. One more excessive chart note. One more conversation with my patients about alternative options. And you'll be escorted from this building by these gentlemen. Do we understand each other?" Katie's eyes locked on his for exactly 2 seconds. In that interval, she calculated 17 different responses, rejected 16 of them, and settled on the only answer that would keep her job. "Yes, doctor." She walked past him into the ICU, her badge catching the overhead light as it swung against her ribs. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The part of her that was still Gunnery Sergeant Katie Morrison, still the woman who'd survived Helmand Province and everything it contained, simply retreated further underground. That night, alone in the supply closet at 11:43 p.m. during the night shift, Katie's hands finally trembled. Not from fear. From the muscular tension of restraint, the kind of trembling that comes from holding everything in place through sheer will. She reached into her locker, behind the spare scrub she kept folded, and pulled out the small flag. It was folded in the precise military triangle, the fabric worn soft from 20 years of handling. It had belonged to her husband's unit. He'd given it to her the night before his first deployment. She'd carried it through his death, through her own trauma, through the medical discharge, through every day since. Her fingers pressed it against her chest as she gripped the metal shelf. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was the accumulation of every insult swallowed, every humiliation absorbed, every moment she'd chosen to stay silent because silence kept her employed. The trembling was restraint at its absolute breaking point, contained in the muscles of a woman who'd been trained to contain far worse. She held the flag until her breathing steadied. Then she returned it to its place and finished her shift. The emergency call came at 2:47 a.m. on Tuesday, motor vehicle accident, multiple trauma, ETA for minutes. The dispatch operator's voice crackled through the intercom with a controlled urgency that meant something catastrophic was heading their way. Katie was at the nurse's station reviewing Raheem's morning labs when the announcement sank in, and she moved toward Trauma Bay 3 before the second page came through. She preps the bay with mechanical efficiency. O-negative blood hanging on the rapid infuser. Intubation tray opened and arranged. Cardiac monitor pads laid out on the table like cards in a reading. Monitor cables tested. She knew this choreography in her sleep. She'd done it thousands of times, during her deployment, during her years at Cedar Creek, during every moment of vigilance that kept people alive long enough for surgeons to finish what trauma had started. The paramedics burst through the trauma doors with a gurney moving at velocity, a patient covered in road rash and gravel embedded in exposed skin, arms wrapped against his body in the protective position of a man who tried to brace himself against the impact. Combat boots visible beneath the trauma blanket. A tattoo on the visible forearm, insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. Katie glanced at the face and the world stopped. Beneath the oxygen mask and blood and swelling was the face of an 8-year-old boy. Raheem. The same eyes, older now, haunted with the weight of 20 years he hadn't yet lived when she'd pulled him from rubble in Helmand Province. The same child she'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire with shrapnel in her leg and his weight in her arms, whispering that he was going to be okay, that Valkyrie had him, that he was going to make it home. Her hands paused for only a fraction of a second, a moment of recognition so profound it felt like time folding in on itself, before training took over and her body moved back into its operational rhythm. "What's his vitals?" she asked the paramedic, her voice level even as her chest tightened with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 2 decades. "BP 86 systolic, dropping. Heart rate 118. O2 sat 73 on 15 liters non-rebreather. Suspected abdominal trauma, possible rib fractures. He's been drifting in and out of consciousness." Katie began hooking leads to the cardiac monitor as the paramedics transferred him to the trauma bed. She pushed an 4-line into his left arm, 18-gauge needle, flash of blood in the hub, saline running, and her voice caught slightly when she said his name. Raheem. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus through the haze of shock and pain and whatever they'd given him in the ambulance. For a moment, there was nothing but confusion. Then recognition bloomed, a spark across his face so profound it looked like waking from a long sleep. "Valkyrie," he whispered, his voice hoarse, using the call sign from a time that felt like a different life entirely. "I'm here," Katie said. The words came out as a command, as a promise, as something that transcended professional distance. "Stay with me. You're going to be okay." His eyes closed again before he could respond, but his right hand found hers for a single second. Contact, confirmation, the ghost of recognition across 20 years. Dr. Caldwell arrived within 8 minutes, moving into the trauma bay with the authority of a man accustomed to owning every space he entered. He read Raheem's chart with increasing irritation, his jaw tightening as he reviewed Katie's detailed documentation of the patient's identifying information, her notes about the Ranger tattoo, her clinical observations about the mechanism of injury. He pulled Katie aside near the medication dispensing station, his voice low and controlled, a knife made of words. "I don't care about your little reunion story," he said. His eyes were flat, professionally cruel. "He's my patient now. You'll assist as directed and nothing more. No special treatment, no emotional involvement. Are we clear?" Katie met his gaze for one long moment. In that moment, something shifted. The carefully constructed boundaries between her two selves, the nurse and the gunnery sergeant, the civilian and the warrior, began to blur at their edges. But her voice remained absolutely professional, absolutely deferential, absolutely compliant. "Clear, doctor." She returned to Raheem's bedside, and her fingers found the folded flag in her scrub pocket, touching it briefly like a talisman, like a reminder of who she actually was beneath the scrubs and the humility and the careful performance of submission. The monitor above Raheem's head beeped its steady rhythm, vital signs holding, blood pressure stabilizing with the fluids running wide open, a body fighting to survive what had tried to destroy it. Katie's hands remained steady on the 4 lines. But the mask was beginning to crack. The monitors told stories if you knew how to read them. Katie had spent 20 years learning that language, in desert tents under artillery fire, in field hospitals where the screaming never stopped, and now in the fluorescent silence of Cedar Creek Medical's ICU at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday that felt like it was testing her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She stood at the central station, ostensibly charting on a patient 3 beds down from Raheem, but her eyes tracked his numbers with the precision of someone who had learned that machines never lied. Humans did. Machines just reported what they saw. His blood pressure had been 128/76 at the start of her shift. Acceptable. Normal for a 28-year-old man recovering from blunt trauma. She had documented it carefully, the way she documented everything, each number a small prayer that he would keep breathing, keep living, keep being the boy she had carried 3 miles through enemy fire and somehow, impossibly, become an Army Ranger. But numbers moved. That was the thing about vital signs. They drifted like weather patterns, subtle shifts that meant nothing alone but everything in sequence. By 11:30 p.m., Raheem's systolic pressure had crept down to 122. His heart rate had climbed from 84 to 92. Small changes. The kind that competent nurses caught before physicians had to. The kind that got your patient to emergency surgery before the collapse became irreversible. Katie had pulled up his chart and requested a CT angiogram, a scan that would show whether internal bleeding was pooling in his chest cavity, whether the trauma surgeons had missed something during their initial assessment. Thoracic imaging. Standard protocol for a trauma patient with a penetrating injury to the chest wall, even one that appeared to have closed without major damage. Dr. Caldwell's response had come via phone at 11:34 p.m., his voice carrying that familiar edge of dismissal. "You're being paranoid, Morrison. His vitals are acceptable. No unnecessary imaging, it's not cost-effective for what's probably nothing." The line had gone dead before she could respond. Before she could tell him that cost-effectiveness meant nothing if the patient bled out internally. That pain was information, and the pattern she was seeing in his declining pressures and rising heart rate was a specific message: something was wrong. She had escalated to Dr. Chen, the attending physician on duty, showing him the trend line on the monitor display, the gentle downward slope of systolic pressure, the subtle upward creep of heart rate, the peripheral oxygen saturation that was beginning to drift despite supplemental oxygen running through the nasal cannula at 3 liters per minute. Chen had reviewed the chart with the careful attention of someone trained to listen to nurses who had been at the bedside watching trends rather than snapshots. For a moment, Katie had felt the smallest spark of hope. Chen understood. She could see it in his face, the recognition that this was the early warning system of a body beginning to fail. Then Chen had called Caldwell back. The conversation had been brief. Katie had watched Chen's expression shift from concern to resignation, had seen him make a note in the electronic health record that would follow Raheem forever: attending physician concurs with on-call surgeon. No CT imaging at this time. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened at 11:55 p.m. was worse. Caldwell had arrived in person. He had walked onto the ICU floor with the swagger of a man who owned the building, his eye scanning the space until they landed on Katie at the nurse's station. He had moved toward her with the kind of predatory confidence she recognized from her years in the military, the confidence of someone wielding institutional power like a blade. He had cornered her against the desk, his presence making the air pressure change in a way that made her neck muscles tense. "I'm reassigning Raheem to Nurse Thompson for the remainder of the night," he had said, not asked. "You're too emotionally compromised. In fact, you're restricted from his room entirely. That's an order." His smile had been the smile of a man who believed he held all the cards. He had already begun typing into the electronic record, his fingers moving with the authority of someone who knew the system would back him. She watched him add the notation: inappropriate emotional attachment affecting clinical judgment. Katie had stood there, her jaw tightening by a fraction of a millimeter, her breathing pattern unchanged. She had not trembled. She had not flushed red. She had simply nodded once and turned back to her charting, because that was what the mask required. That was what survival demanded. The real storm was internal, the part of her that had executed combat medical procedures on screaming soldiers, that had made life-or-death decisions under fire, that was currently screaming at her to break protocol and walk into that room anyway. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not yet. Thompson had taken over at 12:15 a.m., a competent nurse with 7 years of experience who had no reason to suspect that the attending and on-call surgeon were prioritizing hospital margins over patient safety. Katie had watched from across the ICU as Thompson settled into her routine, checking lines, verifying medication infusions, documenting vitals. Standard work. Good work. But Thompson wasn't watching the pattern. She was watching individual data points, the way most nurses did, the way the system trained them to do. Katie had continued her charting for the other 3 patients in her assignment, because that was what protocol required, because stepping out of line would only give Caldwell ammunition, because she had learned 20 years ago that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was reveal how much you actually cared. Her hands had moved through the routine with the steady precision of muscle memory, for lines checked, medication reconciliation verified, intake and output tallied. Each movement a small act of restraint. At 1:15 a.m., the monitor alarm had shattered the midnight quiet of the ICU like a gunshot through glass. Katie's head had come up before the second beep, her body already moving on instinct, her eyes finding the source. Bed 7. Raheem's bed. The waveform on the monitor was no longer the steady rhythm of a healing cardiac patient. It was the erratic spike and dip of someone in profound shock, his systolic pressure dropping in real time, the numbers tumbling like a collapsing building: 110, 105, 98, 92. His heart rate was climbing past 130 now, the desperate tachycardia of a body trying to compensate for massive blood loss. Thompson had moved, calling for the charge nurse, requesting an stat page to the on-call surgeon. Katie had moved too, her body responding to the crisis in the way all of her training had programmed it to respond: rapid assessment, immediate action. But she had made it exactly 3 steps toward Raheem's room before the charge nurse, Janet Morrison, had intercepted her with a hand raised in warning. You heard Dr. Caldwell. You're not allowed in there. Janet's voice was sympathetic but firm, the voice of someone following orders they didn't understand but wouldn't question. Thompson's got it. The surgeon's being paged. Katie had stopped. She had stood at the threshold of Raheem's room, her hands curling and uncurling at her sides, watching through the glass as Thompson scrambled to establish better access, as she checked the 4 lines and the monitor leads, as she called out the numbers that all told the same story: aortic rupture. The kind of hemorrhage that would exsanguinate him in minutes. The kind of emergency that required immediate surgical intervention. 20 minutes out. That's what Thompson would say next. That's what the surgeon had told dispatch when the page went through. The surgeon was at home, probably asleep, and would need to get to Cedar Creek from a residential neighborhood on the south side of Savannah. 20 minutes in the best case. 18 if he drove like someone whose patient's life depended on it. Raheem had 18 minutes. Maybe less. Katie could calculate it the way she had calculated 100 similar scenarios in the past 2 decades. Blood loss at this rate meant 90 seconds per liter. A human body had roughly 5 liters of blood. Do the math. Subtract the hemorrhage happening right now. Factor in shock cascade, organ failure, the cascade of cellular death that began the moment oxygen delivery became inadequate. Raheem had maybe 8 minutes before cardiac arrest became irreversible. He had maybe 4 minutes before his brain began dying. He had seconds before the gap between what Thompson could do with standard protocols and what Raheem actually needed to survive became a canyon too wide to cross. Katie stood at the threshold, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her eyes reading the monitor the way a sniper reads wind direction. She was restricted from the room. She was emotionally compromised. She was ordered to step back. She was also the only person in Cedar Creek Medical who knew how to do what would need to happen in the next 60 seconds if Raheem was going to see another sunrise. 3 seconds. That was all Katie Morrison needed to make a decision that would cost her everything. The monitor alarm screamed its flat, desperate wail at 1:17 a.m. Raheem's aorta was tearing itself apart, and the on-call surgeon was still 17 minutes away. Katie stood at the threshold of room for 12, watching the blood pressure numbers plummet like a stone through dark water, 70/40, 68/38, dropping. Dropping. The oxygen saturation that had climbed so carefully over the past 2 hours was already collapsing back toward the numbers that meant death. Thompson, the charge nurse, placed a hand on her shoulder. Katie, you need to step back. Caldwell's orders. Katie didn't answer. She was already moving toward the crash cart. Katie, I'm serious. He said. I know what he said. Her voice came out flat, factual. He also said Raheem doesn't need a CT. He also said I'm emotionally compromised. And he also said the on-call surgeon would be here in time. She pulled the sterile crash cart toward the room, her limp barely noticeable now, adrenaline overriding the old shrapnel pain in her femur. Thompson's fingers fell away from her arm. Call security if you want, Katie said, not looking back. But I'm not letting him die because of hospital politics. Raheem's eyes were already rolling back, his body's last desperate signals flashing across the monitor like a Morse code of ending. Katie pushed into the room and closed the curtain behind her. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone overhead as she grabbed the scalpel from the crash cart's sterile pack, her fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had done this before. Not in a hospital. Not with time and backup waiting in the wings. But in a shattered compound in Helmand Province with nothing but her training and the difference between breathing and not breathing. Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing about muscle memory, it didn't belong to the person you became. It belonged to the person you used to be, and that person woke up now, muscle and bone and 20 years of surgical precision flooding back into her fingertips like muscle memory was water finding its level. She exposed Raheem's chest with a lateral thoracotomy incision, the scalpel cutting between ribs with the same economical motion she'd performed 1,000 times in field medicine. The smell of blood filled the small space, copper and iron, the scent of life leaking out where it shouldn't be. Her breathing stayed even. Her hand stayed steady. She found the pericardium, opened it, and there was the rupture, the aorta tearing like a dam breaking from the inside out. A Kelly forceps from the surgical tray became her tool. Her fingers clamped it across the rupture with the kind of precision that only came from having already seen the alternative. The monitor stuttered, then found something resembling a rhythm again. Pressure climbing. 72/41. 74/43. Not normal. Not stable. But alive. Raheem's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, pupils blown wide with the shock of it all, and they found hers. For one breath, just one, the recognition flickered there. A boy who had been 8 years old in a desert thousands of miles away saw the face of the American medic who had pulled him from the rubble, who had carried him 3 miles through gunfire, who had told him in Pashto and broken English that he was going to live, he was going to survive, he was going to become something great. The boy saw Valkyrie looking down at him through the pain, and then consciousness folded away like water going down a drain. Katie held the clamp steady. Her scrub soaked through with blood. Her forearms coated in it. Her breath measured and controlled like she was meditating on the edge of a blade. The surgical team arrived in 12 minutes. They found her like that, Katie Morrison, RN, standing over an open thoracic cavity with a Kelly forceps in her hand and a monitor showing the faintest whisper of a viable rhythm. The lead surgeon, Dr. Patricia Hassan, took one look at the field and said nothing. There was no good answer to give her. Instead, Hassan simply nodded, moved into position, and began taking over the clamp with the kind of silent respect that only came when one medical professional recognized the desperate brilliance of another. Katie stepped back. Her hands fell away. The surgical team swept in around the bed like water closing over a stone, and she was suddenly on the other side of the curtain, in the hallway, the sounds of resuscitation continuing without her. Thompson was crying. "You're insane. You know that? You're completely insane." Katie didn't respond. She walked to the sink and began washing the blood from her hands, watching it spiral down the drain in dark, spiraling threads. The hot water burned against her skin, but she didn't flinch. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 2:43 a.m. Not to congratulate her. Not to recognize what she'd just done. He arrived with his phone already in his hand, already making calls. By 3:15 a.m., he had reached the hospital board chairman at his home. By 4:30 a.m., he had contacted the director of Katie's nursing school, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who taught ethics and had known Katie for 4 years, asking pointed questions about any disciplinary history, any patient complaints, any evidence of instability or boundary violations. By 5 a.m., he had brought in a risk management consultant named David Pierce from an outside firm, a man with the kind of smile that looked like it had been surgically installed. They met in Caldwell's office, and the three of them began constructing a narrative. Katie was at her locker when Sarah found her at 6:50 a.m., still in her blood-soaked scrubs, pulling her things into a canvas bag. "What are you doing?" Sarah's voice was small. "Cleaning out." "Katie, no. You saved his life. Everyone knows that. Everyone's talking about it. The surgical team is saying you performed emergency surgery. I performed emergency medicine. Outside my scope. Outside hospital protocol. Outside the chain of command." Katie's voice was steady. She wasn't looking at Sarah. She was looking at the locker's empty interior, the place where she'd hung her badge every day for 8 years. "Dr. Caldwell has already called the board. I'm being terminated. He's being very generous about not pressing criminal charges. That's insane. You can't just." "I can. And apparently I will." At 7 a.m., Katie sat across from Dr. Caldwell in his office. He was immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, his hands folded on the desk in front of him like he was praying. The morning light came through the windows behind him, and his shadow fell across the desk like a sundial. "Gross violation of protocol," he said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "Practicing medicine without a license. Endangering patient safety through emotional compromise." The board met at dawn. They're being remarkably understanding, given the circumstances. "You're done here, Morrison." Effective immediately. Katie didn't argue. She had saved Raheem's life. She had also violated every boundary Cedar Creek Medical had established, and Dr. Caldwell had made sure the entire administrative structure understood that. He wasn't wrong, legally. He was just selective about which protocols he cared about. "Clean out your locker," Caldwell continued, that smile still fixed in place like a painting. "Cedar Creek has excellent legal counsel. You should consider yourself fortunate I'm not pursuing criminal charges. You understand?" Katie understood. She left his office without speaking. She returned to her locker and finished what she'd started. Sarah wasn't there anymore, probably pulled aside by someone who understood how institutional power flowed. Katie slipped the folded flag from her personal items into the bag with everything else. The flag was the color of old mourning, creased into a perfect triangle from being held for 20 years. She never looked at it in daylight. That night, Katie stood in the rain at the Bonaventure Cemetery, in front of a headstone that read Jacob Morrison, 1974 to 2004. The rain fell in sheets, hammering against her shoulders, plastering her hair against her face. She spoke to the stone the way she always did, the way no one else knew about. "I finally had a chance, Jake," she said, her voice cracking for the first time in 8 years. "I finally got to use everything you taught me. Everything about courage. Everything about doing the right thing no matter the cost. And I still lost everything anyway." Her knees bent. The mud soaked through her jeans. "I failed you," she whispered. "I failed all of them. But that wasn't the worst part." 3 days later, the hospital's routine background audit flagged an anomaly. The insurance verification system had been checking Katie Morrison's credentials against standard databases when it triggered a secondary flag, a classified security clearance still active in Department of Defense systems. No routine nurse should have had that. And that mismatch, that single inconsistency in the bureaucratic machinery, set in motion something Dr. Caldwell had no idea was happening. The hospital administrator, Margaret Torres, pulled Katie's full military service record late Friday afternoon and went pale. She read through pages of documentation, medals, unit assignments, combat citations. Then she called an emergency session of the hospital board for Monday morning. When Katie arrived at the board meeting, summoned by a letter that just said to explain the unauthorized procedure, she was still in civilian clothes, still limping more than she had in months because without the adrenaline, the old wound in her femur remembered itself. She began explaining the thoracotomy, her hands describing the procedure with clinical precision, when the conference room door opened. Raheem entered in a wheelchair, still pale but undeniably alive, pushed by another ranger in dress uniform. When he saw Katie, something shifted in his face, recognition, gratitude, and something that looked like it might have been love, the kind of love that only happens between people who have held each other's lives in their hands. "That's Valkyrie," Raheem said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent room like a bell. "She's the one who saved me. Twice." Dr. Caldwell excused himself from the board meeting with a practiced smile, claiming a patient emergency that didn't exist. His shoes clicked against the tile hallway with the rhythm of a man who'd never considered the possibility of failure. Security footage would later show him moving directly toward his office, bypassing the ICU entirely, his jaw tightening with each step. The fluorescent lights overhead cast his shadow long and distorted against the walls, a silhouette already beginning to fracture. His office door locked behind him with a soft magnetic hiss. Caldwell moved to his computer with the precision of someone destroying evidence, his fingers moving across the keyboard with increasing desperation. Deletion after deletion. Billing code spreadsheets vanished. Supplier meeting notes dissolved into nothing. Kickback arrangement documentation erased. Each file disappearing into the digital void felt like salvation, like a second chance materializing before his eyes. He'd weathered storms before, a lawsuit in 2009, an insurance audit in 2014. This would be no different. He was too connected, too valuable, too embedded in the hospital's financial architecture to fall. What he didn't know was that Marcus Webb, Cedar Creek's IT director and a former Marine Corps intelligence officer who'd served 3 tours in Kandahar, had received an anonymous email 2 days earlier flagging suspicious file access patterns in Caldwell's admin account. Marcus had been monitoring in real time ever since, watching the doctor's activities like a sniper tracking a target through a scope. Every deletion Caldwell made was being captured and backed up automatically to encrypted servers Marcus had configured years ago, a system within the system, invisible and patient. Caldwell reached for the security footage server next, his breathing shallow now, his composure beginning to crack like ice under spring thaw. He typed his administrator credentials. The system locked him out. An alert pinged across Marcus's phone at that exact moment, unauthorized access attempt, timestamp 1447, Dr. James Caldwell. Marcus Webb stood from his desk in the IT basement and climbed the stairs with the unhurried pace of someone who'd already won. He'd seen this pattern before in Kandahar. Cornered men made predictable choices. He didn't run. Running meant panic. Running meant defeat. He walked. The knock on Caldwell's office door came like a judge's gavel. "Come in." Marcus stepped inside and closed the door behind him with deliberate softness. He stood in the doorway like an immovable object, 6 feet of muscle and certainty, his Marine Corps ring catching the overhead light. "Dr. Caldwell, I need you to step away from that computer. Now." Caldwell spun in his chair, his face cycling through expressions like a broken film reel, surprise, indignation, then something darker. Calculation. Threat assessment. "This is my private office. You have no authority. I have copies of everything you just deleted." Marcus's voice was flat, conversational, the kind of calm that came from having already seen the worst. "Semper Fi, Doctor. I don't let anyone steal from veterans." The color drained from Caldwell's face in a way that was almost clinical to observe. His mouth opened. Closed. The silence in the office became a living thing, pressing down like altitude. Marcus turned and left without waiting for a response. Behind the closed door, Caldwell heard the sound of his own breathing, rapid, shallow, the respiration of a drowning man in an air-filled room. He reached for his phone. His hand shook. His carefully constructed world, the one built on billing fraud and institutional silence, was collapsing with the slow inevitability of a controlled demolition. Within an hour, Marcus delivered encrypted drives to 3 locations simultaneously: the State Medical Board office in downtown Atlanta, the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division field office, and Cedar Creek's legal counsel. The evidence was comprehensive and damning: inflated billing codes on 12 unnecessary procedures, each one targeting veteran patients whose insurance would cover costs without significant pushback. Kickback arrangements documented in email threads that Caldwell had somehow believed were protected by attorney-client privilege. Spreadsheets showing Katie's meticulous charting flagged as a risk factor precisely because her documentation made the fraud transparent. The scheme wasn't sophisticated, it was merely brazen, built on the assumption that no one was paying attention. No one ever was. The hospital board chairman reviewed the evidence at 15:32 that afternoon. He made a single phone call to the hospital's legal team, his voice steady as granite: "We need full cooperation with federal investigators. Dr. Caldwell is suspended immediately, effective now. Security escorts him from the building within the hour. Cooperate completely with the FBI. This ends today." The decision took for seconds to communicate and would take for months to prosecute. Security found Caldwell in his office attempting to destroy his personal laptop. They escorted him from the building at 16:47, his hands zip-tied in front of him not for security but for his own dignity, giving the appearance of restraint rather than resistance. Staff members watched from their stations as he passed through the main hallway. No one spoke. No one moved. The room went dead silent. Katie was standing in the parking lot when he emerged, returning at the board chairman's specific request. She'd been told she might see this moment, and she'd chosen to bear witness. Not out of vindication, that was beneath her, but out of necessity. Closure required presence. She stood beside Marcus Webb's car, her posture identical to her posture during morning rounds, spine straight, hands loose at her sides, face a perfectly composed mask. Caldwell saw her. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. In that moment, Katie's expression didn't change. Her composure didn't crack. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply looked at him with the flat, clinical assessment of someone examining a failed procedure. Her gaze contained no anger, no satisfaction, no emotion at all, only the unmistakable recognition of a man who'd already been erased from relevance. She looked away first. No, that was his misremembering. She never looked away. She just stopped seeing him. Caldwell's eyes dropped. He turned toward the security vehicle. His career at Cedar Creek Medical ended not with drama but with absolute silence, the kind of silence that can only exist in spaces where the audience has decided you no longer deserve their attention. 6 months later, the parking lot of Cedar Creek Medical filled with cars on a Thursday evening in late spring. The auditorium on the 3rd floor had been decorated for a ceremony that the hospital's administration knew would define their institutional character for the next decade. 200 staff members filled the seats: nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, housekeeping staff, security officers, administrators. The waiting room had a weight to it, the kind of anticipatory tension that precedes moments of genuine historical consequence. Katie Morrison walked onto the stage wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 20 years. The navy blue was tailored perfectly, and across her chest hung medals arranged in ascending order of prestige: Bronze Star, then Silver Star, then the 2 Purple Hearts side by side, and below them all, a Navy Cross. The room rose before she'd even reached the podium. 200 people, all standing. The sound of chairs scraping back echoed like applause. The hospital's board chairman stepped forward and read from a tablet, his voice resonating through the auditorium with the cadence of official recognition. Gunnery Sergeant Katie Morrison, Special Forces Medical Corps, 20 years of service, including 14 operational deployments to Helmand Province and Kandahar. Recognized for exceptional bravery under fire on the 23rd of May, 2004, when she provided medical aid to wounded personnel while exposed to direct enemy fire, demonstrating extraordinary composure and skill. She is hereby awarded the Silver Star for valor. The auditorium remained silent except for the Old Navy veteran security guard, who stood at attention and shouted with his entire body, Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, Special Forces. A visiting general who'd been touring Cedar Creek's veteran wing stepped forward, his dress uniform a landscape of its own medals. He read the formal citation aloud, his voice steady and measured, each word a stone placed into a foundation. When he finished, he extended his hand to Katie, and she shook it with the grip of someone who understood the weight of recognition. Then Raheem was wheeled onto the stage, his legs still in a partial cast but his posture already showing signs of returning to military bearing. He wore his Army Ranger dress uniform with the careful precision of a young soldier who understood he was wearing history. His voice when he spoke was amplified through the sound system, but what came through wasn't projection, it was vulnerability, pure and unguarded, the sound of a man finally saying something he'd carried for 20 years. When I was 8 years old, my village was bombed. I was buried under concrete blocks and rebar. I thought I was dead. His voice cracked slightly, not from weakness but from the effort of containing emotion. A woman came down into that rubble. In the dark. With bullets hitting everything around her. She pulled me out with her own hands. She carried me 3 miles through enemy fire to the nearest American base, and when I asked her if she was scared, she said, "Fear is just information, kid. Right now I need information to stay useful." I didn't understand that then. I was 8. He paused. The auditorium had stopped breathing. I understand it now. I joined the Rangers because of her. Because I watched a medic in a war zone choose to save me instead of save herself. I watched someone understand that the definition of a warrior isn't someone who kills, it's someone who protects. Someone who stays calm when everything is burning. Someone who understands that the most important weapon in combat is composure. His eyes fixed on Katie's across the distance of the stage. She took shrapnel meant for me that day. I carry that fact with me every single moment I'm wearing this uniform. Gunnery Sergeant Katie Morrison saved my life twice, once when I was a child, and once this year when she performed an emergency field thoracotomy in this hospital to keep my aorta from killing me. She violated every protocol that night because protocols don't matter when someone is dying. Only courage matters. Only clarity. Only the ability to act. The applause, when it came, was the sound of 200 people standing, the sound of recognition moving through a building like current through a circuit. Katie stood without moving, her composure intact, her medals catching the stage lights like stars that had finally found their proper constellation. The closing moment came as evening light slanted through the auditorium windows. Katie held the folded flag, not the one from her locker anymore, but the original, presented by the hospital with ceremony and precision. She held it against her heart the way soldiers do when everything that matters is being acknowledged simultaneously. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear, the voice of someone who had finally become visible again. My husband taught me that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing what's right when everything is on the line. When the protocols fail. When the power structures work against you. When the only thing between a human being and death is your willingness to act. She paused, and the auditorium was so quiet the sound of the evening rain against the windows became audible. This award belongs to every medic, nurse, and corpsman who makes that choice every single day. To everyone who carries the weight of lives they've saved and the loss of lives they couldn't. That's what it means to wear a uniform. That's what it means to heal. At the Savannah VA hospital across the city, a man named Dr. James Caldwell mopped the floor of the third hallway, the one with the portraits of decorated veterans lining the walls. His plea agreement with federal prosecutors stipulated 2,000 hours of community service, roughly 1 year of part-time work, distributed across his remaining time in Georgia before he was required to relocate. The court system had been efficient. The prosecution had been thorough. The sentence had been carefully calibrated to avoid prison time, which meant Caldwell got to spend his remaining professional life in a federal facility watching the photographs of people he'd defrauded and dishonored. He passed the newest portrait on the wall without stopping. Gunnery Sergeant Katie Morrison, Director of Combat Trauma Integration, Cedar Creek Medical, Savannah. In the photograph, she stood beside Raheem in his dress uniform, and she held a folded flag against her heart. The plaque beneath the frame read, honoring those who understand that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Caldwell's mop continued its mechanical pattern across the tile floor. The sound of water and bristles became a rhythm that would define the remainder of his days, the sound of reduction, of erosion, of a man who'd built his career on taking from those who had nothing, watching his legacy dissolve into the institutional memory of buildings he no longer had the right to enter. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Katie stood in Cedar Creek's ICU training room with a group of 8 new nurses gathered around a simulation mannequin. Beside the training station, mounted in a glass case with soft lighting, was the folded flag, the original, the one from her locker. The plaque beneath it read, in memory of Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres, Special Forces Medical Corps, killed in action, Helmand Province, May 23, 2004. His sacrifice taught us that the most important equipment in an emergency isn't a machine. It's courage. It's clarity. It's the ability to act when everything depends on you. Katie's voice moved through the training space with the absolute authority of someone who'd earned the right to command attention. She was teaching a field thoracotomy procedure, the same procedure she'd performed on Raheem 3 months earlier, the procedure that had cost her a career and then, in ways she still didn't fully comprehend, had given her everything back. Scalpel. Left anterolateral approach, fourth intercostal space. Her hands moved with the precision of memory made manifest. You're looking for the pericardium, that's the membrane surrounding the heart. You find it, you open it, and you get your hands on that aorta. Everything else is secondary. Pain is information. Fear is information. Your job is to convert that information into action. She looked at each nurse in turn, her eyes moving from face to face. Some of you will never need to know this procedure. And that will be wonderful. That will mean you lived in a time when field thoracotomy remained theoretical. She paused. But if you ever do need it, I need to know that you're capable of the kind of courage it requires. Not the bravery of combat. The bravery of absolute clarity under conditions where everything is failing. The bravery of knowing that the only person standing between a human being and death is you. One of the nurses raised her hand, a young woman, early 30s, with the careful posture of someone still learning to inhabit authority. Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, how did you know? How did you know that the procedure would work? Katie set down her instrument and looked directly at the nurse. I didn't. I knew it was possible. I knew it was necessary. I knew that doing nothing guaranteed death, so any action that created even a minimal chance of survival was the correct choice. She let that settle. That's the decision matrix. Not will this work, but does this create a probability of success that exceeds the certainty of doing nothing? The room filled with the sound of pens writing on notepads. The sound of learning. The sound of institutional knowledge being transferred through the deliberate, patient repetition of people who understood that lives depended on perfect clarity. Katie returned to her demonstration, and the evening deepened around Cedar Creek Medical. Inside the ICU, monitors beeped their rhythmic assurances. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical persistence. For pumps ticked off seconds with the regularity of heartbeats, and in the training room, a gunnery sergeant with a Navy Cross and 2 Purple Hearts and the kind of composure that comes only from having survived the unsurvivable taught the next generation what it meant to understand that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.